for being here today. How did Russian security forces fail to prevent this attack, even after such an explicit and early warning from the United States?
Well, thank you for having me. The attack is certainly a tragedy, and it certainly is something of a shock that such a large-scale attack was able to take place in Moscow, which has had such heightened security measures for some time. I think the choice of location was very important. The Crocus City Mall attack took place just outside Moscow's Ring Road. That apparently allowed the perpetrators to at least initially escape, although a lot of questions still remains around the Russian security forces' response there. And then the reality is that much of the security that we do see in Moscow in these places is often very much theater. There are metal detectors everywhere, but they are very rarely used. And frankly, the whole security force apparatus has been focused on Putin's war in Ukraine rather than on protecting Russia domestically.
Max, help us understand what the contagion risk is right now as well. This attack has certainly raised the profile and the possible recruitment capabilities of ISIS-K. Is there a risk now that it sparks other attacks elsewhere, perhaps?
Well, we've seen this come as part of a wave of recent Islamic State attacks. We also just had an attack in Iran. The group is very much still active, and we do know it has had some success in recruiting amongst Tajik migrant communities in Russia in the past, as well as in Central Asia itself. I don't know if this one attack is necessarily a signal that it has major new capabilities in that region. It seems to have been, again, from what evidence we have so far, a lot of which is dependent on coming from Russian media channels that frankly aren't very trustworthy, and where we've seen these suspects already tortured on camera and brutalized. So we're lacking a little bit of information there, but that ISIS has had this capability in Russia has been known for a long time. Whether it seeks to follow it up with additional attacks remains to be seen, but certainly there's also the Islamic State Caucasus Emirate in the North Caucasus, which has continued to be active in recent years and which also has the potential to carry out attacks there.
And is it fair to say that Moscow has indeed been a target of ISIS-K for some time now?
Oh, yes, certainly. I mean, the Islamic State has carried out attacks in Moscow and in St. Petersburg in the past. It is not new that they are targeting them. Of course, Russia has also been involved in anti-Islamic State operations in Syria in the past. What's interesting, though, is that Putin doesn't really seem to be focusing on that aspect of it. He's very much trying to blame Ukraine for this attack. There's no evidence of any Ukrainian involvement. It doesn't fit in line with the types of attacks that Kyiv has carried out on Russia in the past, including ongoing, and just this morning, the latest apparent drone attack on Russian infrastructure. So that seems very unlikely, but Putin is so obsessed with his conflict in Ukraine that I think he's going to focus his security force response there and use this essentially as an excuse to try to build up that narrative. Whether there's more military assets he can commit to it, having already been fighting a full-out war for over 2 years, I'm not so sure. But I think he's going to at least attempt to try to build it up in the public's image in Russia, where everything is controlled by the state media and there is no free debate over these issues, and to try to use it to shift the blame to Ukraine. So that will itself leave Russians less secure, because he's focusing on a not real security risk that has now brought conflict to Russia's borderlands, but of course the majority of which is suffered by the Ukrainian people, while he is neglecting these real security risks that Russia still does face.
Max, this is a really big and important point that you're making, because this attack also comes less than a week after the election, where Putin claimed victory. At the same time, Putin has been very quick to point the finger of blame towards Ukraine. The US intelligence services say Ukraine was not involved at all, and you make a good point about how the style and characteristics of this attack simply do not align with recent military activity that Ukraine has been involved in. So to expand on that point, how might Putin use this to advance his broader geopolitical objectives, particularly when it comes to the war in Ukraine? And how might we see the West and the United States respond as a result?
I think it's important that the West respond by making clear that there is no evidence for these claims and that they continue to stand with and support Ukraine, because Putin will clearly use this for his domestic agenda. Whether it has any success on sort of the international sphere and changing things really depends on how the international community in the West respond. And I thought it somewhat tragicomic almost that the Islamic State is out there having to insist that this attack, that they really did coordinate it or help lead it, while Putin is spreading these conspiracy theories. But of course, there's so many voices in the world whose brains have frankly rotted in recent years and are willing to further Putin's fantasies of conspiracy here because it fits their own narrative. I think the other key point to make is that this attack was not the only terrorist attack that took place in that region on that day. You spoke earlier in the clip about the Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure across the country. And that very morning, Friday on the 22nd, Russian missiles hit the Dnipro hydroelectric dam, one of the largest hydroelectric dams in all of Europe, in the city of Zaporozhye in Ukraine, less than 70 kilometers from the front, downstream of which is Russian-occupied territory, but also the key Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant downstream. And these missiles slammed into this dam, which, if it were destroyed, would be far more devastating than what we saw even in the Novokakhovka dam, dam on the same river that was destroyed, again, suspected by Russia last year. And this is not only terrorism of the Ukrainian population for the energy blackouts that they're suffering, for the critical issues in their domestic infrastructure that have resulted, and of course the war aims that has, but for all those people, including in Russian-occupied territory, who are living downstream of it, whose houses could be flooded, and with one of the largest nuclear power plants in the world there as well, potentially at risk of being impacted by it. So, I don't mean to take anything away from the tragedy of what we saw in Moscow. It's obviously horrible, but Vladimir Putin is waging his own terrorism at the same time and will look to use this to excuse that. And I think that is something the international community can't allow.